that time of the week where we take a fresh outlook on the most talked about topics of the week. Thanks to all of our viewers from around the world for joining us. I'm Mia Toski. Well, it has been a tense week and a very busy news week from all corners of the world. Between the crisis in Iraq and the expanded ground operations in Gaza, we also had the tragic Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, which, as everyone knows now, was taken down by a missile just 2 days ago. We have our own expert panel weighing in on the tragedy, but let's update you on the facts that we have as they've been changing minute to minute.
The chief of the Ukrainian Security Service says 3 Russian servicemen crossed the border into Ukraine with a heavy missile launcher and fired at the Malaysia Airlines Flight 17.
We showed a place on the border where a boat crossed into the territory of Ukraine before the attack. And terrorists clearly confirmed that the crew of this boat entered from the territory of Russia and were Russian servicemen.
Meanwhile, a military spokesman confirms Ukraine's army did not carry out any aerial actions.
An inventory of aircraft systems and missile launchers located in Ukrainian territory concluded that all missiles are in stock. The Ukrainian aviation did not work in the area of the air crash.
Over 180 bodies have been recovered so far, some so badly mangled that they are unrecognizable. The U.S. has called for an immediate ceasefire in eastern Ukraine for a fact-finding mission.
The UN Security Council has endorsed this investigation, and we will hold all its members, including Russia, to their word in order to facilitate that investigation. Russia, pro-Russian separatists, and Ukraine must adhere to an immediate ceasefire.
The attack on Thursday afternoon killed 298 people from nearly a dozen nations, including vacationers, students, and a large contingent of scientists heading to an AIDS conference in Australia.
And here are some of the other numbers. The jetliner was carrying, as you just heard, 298 people, including 80 children. The victims came from 11 countries and included one of the world's top AIDS researchers, a nun and teacher from Sydney, and a Dutch senator. The Boeing 777 was flying over Ukraine, where there has been intense fighting between Ukraine and pro-Russian separatists. Joining us now is my co-host and former White House aide, Didi Benke. We also have Albert Goldson, Executive Director at Indo-Brazilian Associates. He is also a pilot. Of course, we have our Dr. Bart Rossi, political psychologist. And via Skype is Bob Clifford, who is an aviation expert out of Chicago with Clifford Law. We thank you also for joining us for the first time. Shooting down a passenger flight is just incomprehensible to have seen this in the last week. Weighing in on thoughts of Didi, just obviously a lot of people are pointing the finger to the Russians. So let's.
Yeah, since we did see the missile launcher go across on camera and it's Russian clearly, and what's disturbing, I think, is the response from Putin, of course, because he's pointing fingers to Ukrainians, and we know it's Russian. I mean, we know this already, and also our president a very weak response, and he goes and he fundraises afterwards. I think the appropriate response was from Senator McCain, saying they'll be held to pay if the Russians have done this, and it shouldn't be empty words, and we need to give weapons to the Ukrainians so they can defend themselves.
Well, there certainly has been a great deal of pontificating from a lot of the leaders, but fundraising at a time like this was questionable. We'll get back to that in a little bit. Albert, obviously you are a pilot when obviously this has been just a horrible, horrible act of terrorism. When you first saw this, I mean, obviously, what were your first initial thoughts?
Well, without a doubt, it basically was it was shocking that another Malaysian airline was involved in this terrible incident, and the fact that it was flying, at the appropriate altitude, and it was hit by a missile certainly would really inflame the situation in an already volatile area.
And we do want to check in with Bob Clifford out in Chicago. And Bob, we were talking about the flights and the fact that they were going over Ukraine. Do you think that they should be banning flights, and should a lot of carriers be rethinking their routes right now?
Well, that's certainly good strategy. The International Civil Aviation Organization and the FAA really need to issue immediate bans for the carriers to fly over these areas. As your other guest correctly pointed, they were above the 32,000 foot airspace floor, if you will. They were 1,000 feet above it, and nevertheless, this kind of thing happened. And if you look at why they went that route, it's an economic thing. That's a route that saves fuel. So it makes it, more economical for the air carrier to go that way. But the fact is, there were 3 known downings of aircraft in that area. It's a hot spot. It's an incredible situation that any air carrier would allow traffic over a war zone. And whether it's the Middle East or whether it's Russia and the Ukraine, they need to take better steps to protect their passengers.
It's a great point, Bob, because there's certainly a lot of hot spots right now in the world. Now, Dee Dee, this question is for you. In terms of this tragic incident has certainly brought some attention to this area. I guess you would say more attention to this area, and some people say that is very much needed.
Well, that's a silver lining to this tragedy. We have almost 300 people dead, and it was such a terrible situation. I think people are in shock. The whole world is. And for Putin to act like he had, he wasn't enabling this. At the very least, he should admit that he was the enabler. I mean, they gave the missiles and they gave the scientific research to help these folks, and that's why we have 300 dead people, 298 dead people.
And 80 children, we want to add also. I mean, that's another tragic number as well. Yeah. Dr. Bart, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I just think that Dee Dee's right. Putin is at fault here. I mean, let's get this right. We know who is at fault. He's the boss, he's in charge, and he has a price to pay here because there's a jury out there too. And it's the world. It's the whole world here. And what we really need right now is for a lot of nations to come together, have a coalition, and fight Putin and put the pressure on him.
Well, a lot of people are arguing that this tragic incident may do just that. So, like Dee Dee said,
that's a good point.
Because the missile is very sophisticated. It had to be the Russians. It had to be Putin. Now, here's the only thing, though. He may have had an insubordinate person make the mistake. And that could have very well happened where he didn't give the order, but it doesn't matter. He's still an enabler, and he still needs to take responsibility.
But when you start shooting down passenger planes, I mean, this is a totally different ballgame right now. Albert, let me ask you a question as a pilot. For all pilots out there, obviously the question is at 33,000 feet, that's a pretty, you think you would be pretty safe at that altitude. Do you think there's going to be fear not only with people who are flying, but with also pilots?
There's definitely a concern because of the advanced technology as far as weaponry is concerned. Anytime you're flying over a hostile territory or even close to a hostile territory, you run the risk of an errant weapon being aimed at your aircraft. In fact, they were given direct orders not to fly over the Crimea, but they could fly over the Ukraine 200 miles north. So again, although you have very sophisticated systems, if you have just one person getting out of line on the ground or what have you, that's a big risk.
But I still think that it's so shocking to see a passenger plane in this kind of instance shot down like this.
Yeah, and you know what bothers me here is the behavior, like sophisticated weapons that we're talking about, and then in the hands of people who are terrorists or separatists. Is this the future? Is this what we're going to be looking at in the future? As a psychologist, this is what bothers me about this incident.
But it's also very upsetting our president, and what you said to me is true. It's so shocking and so upsetting, and he doesn't seem bothered that much by it.
Well, I disagree because
I
think that what we need here is a coalition. The president came out within 24 hours. President Reagan came out four days after. So
let's stick with there's no doubt about it. This is not a bashing Obama, but he did go fundraising.
Yeah, right after 2 fundraisers, and and you saw the speech, and he really even had to backpedal and at least come across a little strong. But right after it happened, it was like, all right, whatever.
I think
it was
I'm
upsetting.
strong.
No, everyone was upset. The international world's upset about his reaction.
And we do want to talk about Dutch and whether the Dutch are going to go after Putin also. But I want to weigh in with Bob out in Chicago again. And Bob, let's talk about the liability for Malaysia Airlines. I mean, obviously, they're not really responsible for something like this. They were told that it was safe to fly there. But what is the liability for them? Let's talk.
Well, there's an international treaty that's part of your ticket that's called the Montreal Convention. And under the Montreal Convention, all of those families will be eligible for about $174,000 in compensation. And there will be a debate and a fight over whether Malaysia is responsible. I maintain that they are because it's not a really high bar to establish that they did not take all necessary measures in order to protect their passengers. And that's their obligation as common carriers. They have the highest duty of care for their passengers.
But Bob, hey Bob, can I just ask you another question? Other airlines were flying through that area, weren't they?
Sure, oh, absolutely, no question about it. And it may well be that if something had happened to one of those, then certainly we'd have the same compensation. But more compelling arguments are going to be placed by Ukraine or Russia. And I think that there will be litigation in Europe, in the Netherlands, at The Hague, possibly in New York, against the countries of Ukraine and or Russia. Because of the very reasons your other guests were talking about, the empowerment that Putin has empowered, these separatists, has given them the weapons. They're using them against, innocent civilians. There's nothing more outrageous than what has happened here with the downing. And if you look at the history of other aircraft downings by military, those governments ultimately paid compensation to those the victims' families.
Bob, we're going to check back with you in just a little bit also. Now let's also talk about just the crime scene in general. They are saying that many of the bodies have not been able to be brought in, but one of the problems right now is that because this is such a highly volatile area, they can't get people into the area. So this is considered a murder scene, and they're compromising the murder scene. So that's another whole layer into this story.
And how interesting, too, that the people we think shot down the plane, they were there immediately. And the question is, do they have the black box? Well, they probably do. But of course, the Russians are lying because that's what all they ever do. I mean, in fact, they had a Russian reporter from RT just quit because he said the entire propaganda machine, I'm sick of lying, I'm not doing it anymore. That's the second reporter. So you cannot believe a word that they say, unfortunately. So they probably have the black box.
Well, the question next is...
The black box isn't going to give them the answers to things here. What's really going to give an answer to things is a forensic examination. There's an FBI and NTSB specialist on their way now to the scene. They hope to get access that can attempt to find traces of the missiles, attack on the plane itself.
But the problem is, it's 48 hours later.
Yeah, the scene's tampered with.
Mostly contaminated. Right.
Absolutely. And certainly want to give some dignity to the victims, and certainly bring the bodies home for the families as well. Final thoughts from you, Albert. Just do you think that the Dutch will go after Putin on this one?
Well, unfortunately, when you have a big disaster like this, particularly in a war zone, you have quite a number of parties, and unfortunately, in many cases, they're using this for their own political agenda. So you really have to sift through exactly how this is going to play out with respect to if there are going to be any punitive action against Russia. What is Russia's next move as far as how Putin will react? Will he be more amenable to working with with Western Europe and the United States? So you really have to keep that in mind.
And certainly just to feel safe again. I think safety is one thing that we're going to be talking about a lot with this incident.
Yeah, I think a lot of people will be looking at the routes that they're flying.
Well, I'm not flying Malaysian Airlines. Maybe it's not their fault, but forget it.
Yeah, well, I think that's another. We do want to thank Bob Clifford. He's an aviation expert with with Clifford Law out in Chicago. Thank you for joining us. And also Albert Goldson, thank you for joining us as well. And keep it here to Fresh Outlook. When we return, we're going to take a look at one of the top stories here in the U.S. Now, not too far from our studios, a police officer was shot and killed this week, ambushed by a gunman. His murder has sparked off fighting in Jersey City that has pitted cops against gangs.